Hello, and welcome to the second lecture on the concept of God. Last time we introduced the attributes of the God of classical theism, and we also looked at the relationship of God and time and the competing views on that. Today we're going to focus in on omnipotence. So how should we go about defining omnipotence? After breaking the word down, we can see that it has two components from Latin: all, omni, and potent or potency, which means power. But is it enough to define God as a being who can do anything? Thomas Aquinas explored what we meant by the omnipotence of God and recognised that we have to be a bit more careful than that. By saying that God can do anything, do we mean that God can make something all yellow and all blue at the same time? Can God make a square circle, a squircle? These are examples of things that cannot be done. They are logical impossibilities, and so even an omnipotent God cannot do the logically impossible. So we find ourselves having to redefine our definition of omnipotence to a being who has the power to do all that is logically possible. But then Aquinas considers other possible qualifications to our definition. Has God got the power to get things wrong? Can God sin? Aquinas is clear that this would not be a possibility for God, who has other perfections, such as being all good and all-knowing. Therefore, we have to re-qualify our definition to become God's omnipotence means that God can do all that is logically possible and doesn't contradict God's nature. But even with these issues cleared up, others are not convinced that an omnipotent being makes sense. J.L. Mackie is one person who has outlined the very famous paradox that points to the incoherence of an omnipotent being. This is known as the paradox of the stone. It stems from one question: can God create a stone so heavy it cannot lift it? Now the issue is that any answer we provide leaves God not having the power to do something. So either we say, yes, God can create a stone so heavy he cannot lift it, and then we're pointing to God's lifting ability being limited. Or we say, no, God cannot create a stone so heavy it cannot lift it. And then we're saying that God's creative abilities are limited. Can you see that by saying that God is limited in some way, is denying or rejecting his power? And God is said to have limitless power. So this paradox is forcing us to accept that this God, who has the power to do everything, cannot do something here, therefore showing that the concept of omnipotent God is incoherent and it just doesn't make sense. Well, the paradox of the stone certainly seems to support the idea that omnipotence is incoherent. But are there any solutions? Well, yes, George Mavrodes thought so. George Mavrodes did not think that this paradox damaged God's omnipotence in any way. He started by asking us to think of God as a being without omnipotence, a being with limited power. If this was the case, it would be completely possible for God to create a stone it couldn't lift. And in the same way for any of us, it would be a possible task we would all be capable of. In fact, the only being for which this is an impossible task is an omnipotent being. For an omnipotent being, this is a logical impossibility. And remember what Aquinas has already addressed, that omnipotence doesn't mean the ability to do the logically impossible. Therefore, God's omnipotence is retained. Let's look at the structure of his argument. So God is omnipotent. Omnipotent beings are capable of performing any task other than that which is self-contradictory. For an omnipotent being, an unliftable stone is self-contradictory. Therefore, God cannot create a stone that God cannot lift, because he cannot perform any self-contradictory task. Therefore, God retains omnipotence. Another response comes from Savage. Savage was in support of Mavrodes, but he wanted to steer away from looking at the limits of God, to show that the paradox can be seen in another way, as pointing towards God's limitlessness. His argument asks us to imagine a stonemaker who can make stones of any weight, and then to imagine a stone lifter who can lift stones of any weight. Then Savage asks us to put both of those roles together in one being, God. He says we have a limitless being, one that can make unlimited stones and lift unlimited weights of stones. We're not talking about limits, we're talking about limitlessness. Therefore, God, through this paradox, is shown to be without limits and remains omnipotent. So, the paradox of the stone and the responses. I'm hoping that you can see that the impact of the paradox of the stone for those thinkers we've looked at is very different. Firstly, for Mackie, the paradox illustrates the incoherence of an omnipotent being. The very idea of something being able to do anything is contradictory and therefore incoherent. Secondly, however, for Mavrodes, the paradox of the stone does not impact the concept of God. If we define omnipotence as the ability to do all that is logically possible, then this is perfectly in keeping with God being omnipotent, as lifting an unliftable stone is a logical impossibility. So in a way, Mavrodes shows how God can retain its omnipotence. So Mavrodes is showing how the paradox of the stone avoids looking at the omnipotence of God. And finally, for Savage, he takes a different approach. He felt that focusing on what God could not do was damaging. Even Mavrodes' solution to an extent does this. Therefore, Savage demonstrated that the paradox does not point to limits of a being, but limitlessness. So actually the arrow from the paradox of the stone is pointing towards omnipotence. What do you think? Who convinces you most? Do you think that by claiming that the God of classical theism is omnipotent is an incoherent claim? Or do you, like Savage and Mavrodes, believe that the stone example from Mackie can be avoided or reinterpreted? So in summary, we've looked at how to define omnipotence. We've looked at some of the problems with the idea of an omnipotent being, and this comes in the form of the paradox of the stone by J.L. Mackie. And we've also looked at possible solutions from George Mavrodes and Savage. Next time, we're going to be moving on to omniscience.